Hello, everyone. This is World Review with Evo Daalder, a weekly look at news from around the world produced by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It's Friday, December 15. Ukraine notched one small little victory this week, with the EU agreeing to open negotiations for the country to join the Union, like sometimes in the next 10 years. But future funding of this war effort and for its economy remain mired in politics, both in the United States Congress and among the countries of the European Union. One slimmer of hope is that Poland this week inaugurated a new government, dispensing with 8-year rules by an increasingly illiberal, and some would say authoritarian government. What will a new government mean for Poland, for the Ukraine, and for Europe? Finally, the long simmering disagreement between Washington and Jerusalem finally spilled out into the open this week as President Biden called on Israel to stop what he called the indiscriminate bombing in Gaza, and Prime Minister Netanyahu made very clear that he rejected any thought of Gaza ever being governed by any Palestinians. Here to talk about these issues are three reporters who covered these stories. Deborah Amos, formerly an international affairs reporter for NPR and now at Princeton University; Peter Spiegel, U.S. editor at the Financial Times; and Jamil Anderlini, editor-in-chief at Politico Europe. Lady, gentlemen, good morning. Wonderful.
Good morning, Evo.
All three of you.
Good morning, Evo. Nice to be here.
Thanks for joining. Peter, let's start with you. Ukraine. I mean, as we talked just before going on the air, Deb said it's replaced Gaza. Who would ever thought of that? But it was a big story this week, both in Washington and in Europe. Bring us up to date where we are. And what's the prospect now that there will actually be funding for the war effort and, importantly, for the economy?
Well, I mean, as you mentioned, I think in your lead-in you said small victory, and I think I would put the underline under small. I mean, it has been celebrated in the last 24 hours in Brussels, in Kiev. Zelensky very excited that he got the agreement on accession talks. But as Jamil knows better than I spent 6 years in Brussels. Countries that agree to accession talks can take decades, and Eva, you said 10 years. I suspect for Ukraine it's going to be even longer than that. I mean, look at Turkey. Turkey's been in accession talks for decades now. So it's highly symbolic. There was a little bit of political jujitsu that happened at the European Council meeting this week, but he didn't get the real important thing, which was the aid. And let's start with Washington, because it's been hung up in Washington now for months. We basically have had the House has gone home, so we're left with the Senate. But even with the Senate, which has tended to be on the Republican side more pro-Ukraine than the House side, they are also having a hard time getting a deal through on aid. I was in Washington last week and ran into Mitt Romney at an event, and we were talking briefly about it. And he said, essentially, the problem for Republicans is if they vote for Ukraine aids, look at all the polls on Republican voters right now. 2/3 to 3/4 of all Republicans now are opposed to Ukraine aid. So his argument was, you're forcing Republicans to vote against their interests. They'll get primaried, and as a result, you're getting no one. Even old supporters are beginning to dwindle, which is why they're trying to pair it with this border security thing. They need to be able to go home to their voters and say, "Don't pay attention to this Ukraine aid thing. I got what we really wanted, which is the border security in the U.S. southern border." But the harsher the Biden administration goes on border security, he starts losing the Democrats. So he's in a real bind right now. We may, Schumer is left the Senate in session. They're trying to strike a deal that includes both Ukraine aid and border security, but it's not clear that even if they get a deal in the Senate, that the House will accept it. So for those who are champions of Ukraine in Washington, it was a very, very dour week when I was down there, and I think this week has made no progress on that. And so I'm very pessimistic. The Pentagon has been able to find little pockets of money here and there to do yet another little bit of military aid, but it's not the kind of aid that Ukraine needs right now. Which then takes us to Europe, where we thought perhaps there was going to be some good news. Again, we got the accession talks because, as Jamil could talk a bit about, Orban was convinced to leave the room when they had the vote. Viktor Orban, the Hungarian prime minister, who has been the most pro-Russian of all the EU prime ministers. Oddly, because of course Orban made his name as a young student, kicking out the Red Army when he was one of the democracy processors in Cold War era Budapest. But he came back in the room when the discussion of aid came up. 50 billion euros was supposed to go to Ukraine. He was the one man holding it out. Now, there are other ways, obviously. The EU doesn't have to do everything collectively. There are, bilateral grants and loans that can go from Germany, from France, from Britain, and they've gone that way in the past. But this was the big symbolic thing that Zelensky was hoping to get this week out of Brussels, was hoping to get out of Washington, and he got neither. And I think, we're getting to a point relatively soon when they start running out of stuff. Eva, you mentioned the economy, and obviously that's an issue as well. But I think for this conversation, I think the much more important thing to focus on is the war effort, because at some point they're going to run out of ammunition, they're going to run out of funding, they're going to suddenly find themselves in this war of attrition against the Russians, and they're going to be attrited, to use Pentagon speak. And I think it's been a very, very bad week for Zelensky and for Kiev for that reason. And I think in many ways the Zelensky's attempt to focus on the EU section victory is a way to try to put a happy smile on a really, really bad week.
Jamil,
I have a slightly different perspective. I do think that in the context, this was, yes, symbolic, but I think highly important symbolism, if you like, because you think about what Ukraine joining the European Union actually means. I mean, it's a fundamental restructuring of the entire institutions of the European Union. The current common agricultural policy in Europe could not function with a Ukraine in it. It is a very, very direct. It's about the most provocative thing that Brussels can do vis-a-vis Russia. Vladimir Putin is to say, right, well, we're actually Ukraine is joining the European Union. Yes, it's only one step in that process, and yes, it's probably going to take a long time, but it's a highly symbolic, big moment. So I do think that it's easy to be a bit dismissive. Oh, that was easy for them to just do that, and they got Orban to leave the room. But I think it's, historically, this was a big moment. I would also say, we spoke to Mark Rutte, the outgoing Prime Minister of the Netherlands, and he was very optimistic that they will have a deal in a few weeks, early mid-January, on the funding for Ukraine. Likewise, other top European leaders were very encouraging and seemed quite relaxed about the possibility or the likelihood that they will get the money, and the money will go to Kiev relatively soon. And it's true that they don't want. They want to show unity, and they don't want to go alone without Viktor Orban, without Hungary's commitment. But they can. They actually have the ability, to do this without Hungary if they really want to. The question is whether, perhaps, and this is maybe more on the side of what you're arguing, I guess, Peter, is perhaps there are other leaders and other countries that also don't really want to give money to Ukraine at the moment, and are quite happy to have Viktor Orban, the spoiler, out there in front, being Moscow's best buddy, because they also don't want to, and that would be much more concerning. We don't know that for sure yet. There are there's a few hints of that. My newsroom is trying to find out more about that, and if anyone's going to tell you about it, it's going to be Politico in Europe. But that would be much more worrying if other countries are sort of using Orban as the sort of the fall guy, and they are also going to try to kick this into the future. That would be quite concerning, I'd say.
To agree with you on one thing, maybe I was being too flip about the EU accession talks, because remember what caused the Maidan revolution in 2014 was a pro-Russian Ukrainian president killing. It wasn't even accession talks at that time; it was just an association agreement with Brussels. And so, Ukraine has wanted to be part of the European family, and the origins of the current conflict go back to whether or not Ukraine will have as they say in Brussels, a European orientation. So Jamil, I will concede on that point.
It's important. Symbolism matters in international politics for sure, but there is a real crunch militarily and economically, Deb, that is happening in Ukraine, that without significant military support, and that really means U.S. support, although we should note that the German government has agreed that despite its budgetary problems, it's going to send almost $9 billion next year to Ukraine. But it's not the ammunition, it's not the air defense missiles that they really need. And this $50 billion was supposed to be to help Ukraine sustain its economy. And whatever's going to happen in the U.S.-Ukraine package, it's not going to have a lot of economic aid. It may have military aid, but not economic aid. So it is kind of crunch time. And yes, January is fine if you can get an agreement in January. But how do you see this? How perilous is this moment when you think about where Ukraine is moving?
So what I'm watching is the rhetoric and how desperate it's starting to sound. A lot of the military people are saying, don't you understand what a deal this is? We couldn't afford to degrade the Russian army as much as the Ukrainians have done it. I mean, the numbers this week are like eye-popping. The percentage of soldiers who died between the beginning of the war and now, it's just astonishing. And so I find myself gauging where we are by that kind of talk. I don't think it will move Republicans who are facing constituencies who don't want to fund this war, who don't get the argument that this is the best deal that they're going to get. So we may just slosh into January without a deal. It would be, devastating for Ukraine, and it will be. But we may get there.
Well, and Peter, it's not going to get any easier in the United States. January 15th, Iowa caucuses, latest Des Moines Register, the poll of all polls when it comes to Iowa has Trump at 51%. If Trump wins, in that sort of level, it's almost over. And how many Republicans on the House and in fact in the Senate are going to run against Donald Trump on the issue of Ukraine?
Well, I think that's the point. And again, look, I don't want to get too much into domestic politics. You do have Nikki Haley, who is the candidate with the momentum, who is, in many ways, an old school Reaganite when it comes to these kinds of issues, and is a very pro Ukraine, and is suddenly getting momentum. The other thing I'll say, it's 51%, is just barely majority. So if there is a way to coalesce the non-Trump candidates, you could have a bit of a race here, particularly post Iowa if some of the others drop out. So I keep hope alive. I think Nikki Haley is an interesting candidate. She's getting a lot of the money from Wall Street and the other bits of the Republican Party who are not willing to back Donald Trump. So I still think we got a race there. But your point, Evo, is the bigger one, which is it's come to a point now, and we thought maybe it would get there eventually, but it's come there now, that the Republican Party has been trumped on Ukraine. And as a result, it's going to be very hard to peel off onesie-twosies in either the House or the Senate to get them to back Ukraine funding. And I don't even know that there is a border deal to be done that gets it through. And that, to me, is what all the hand-wringing was about in Washington the week I made the rounds. It was the pro-Ukraine crowd in both parties was just, every conversation I had was just so dejected because they're facing the stark reality now. And I guess could a Haley candidacy and a Haley juggernaut change the conversation with the Republican Party? I think so, but I think there's only an outside chance of that. And even if there was a Haley run going into the primaries, I think he is in the House in particular, but obviously in the Senate as well. Trump still looms so large over this wing of the party. You got J.D. Vance going on Steve Bannon's TV show and calling the Ukrainians all criminals and corrupt and stuff like that. I mean, it's become incredibly nasty within the Republican Party on the Hill. And I think the pessimism I got was when I was in Washington, which was really, really shocking in that regard.
Can I say one thing about political polls? 2020, they were all wrong, all of them. And I've stopped even looking at them. I do not have a change of blood pressure at 51%. I do not, because who knows? And that's another problem, but it's a different problem than reaction.
The point I always make on that, Deb, just to interrupt you, is this time 4 years ago, Joe Biden's campaign was dead. Right? It was chaos. It was never going to happen. It was over. And then boom, he wins South Carolina and he's president of the United States. So I think you're 100% right on that. That's why I just... No.
I mean, listen, let's have the voters have a say when it comes to these things. The problem is that polls do matter for politicians. And if they see what, the fact that Mitt Romney thinks that it's not in Republican interest to vote for Ukraine aid is kind of an interesting way to frame what the interest of Republicans are, which is apparently political as opposed to what's good for the country. Because, of course, Mitt Romney and so many other Republicans do think that supporting Ukraine is really important. In fact, if you'd have a blind vote in the House and the Senate, you have overwhelming margins of people supporting it for all the reasons that people lay out. Jamil, I want to end with you on this part, and then we'll go to Poland, because you did make the point that you thought that there was sufficient political movement in favor of getting significant economic aid through to Ukraine, and there is bilaterally a lot of military aid. I mean, one of the notable features is in the U.S. debate and early on in Ukraine, there was this worry: will Europe stay the course? And it's pretty darn clear right now that if any part of this Western alliance is staying the course, it's in Europe and a little less in the United States. Is that how you see it? Is that no matter what happens in Washington, Europe is going to continue to push?
Well, that's the big question, really. And but to your point, and to extend it slightly even further, the most astonishing is that Germany is now the one that's like really, you know, when Germany has a Zeitenwende, they really stick with it. It's quite amazing to watch. And some of the optics around this, where, you know, you had we had a joint op-ed today from very senior Germans and very senior Ukrainians talking about, you know, now Germany is with us shoulder to shoulder, and yeah, they're still holding out on some of the most needed weapons, long-range missiles and some of the air defense, but they are delivering, and they're delivering a lot, and that is quite a shift. And
Jamil, if you'll excuse my interruption here,
shift, yeah,
the one thing, the other person who was in Washington last week besides Peter Spiegel was David Cameron, Ghost of Christmas Past, the new UK Foreign Secretary, and his point was he was there to lobby on behalf of Ukraine, and he kept making the point repeatedly that Jamil just made, which is, I think the Americans seem to think the Europeans haven't made their lived up to what the Americans have done. If you look at the total, I haven't checked his math, but if you look at the total of military and economic aid, we're now equal, Europe and the U.S. So if there is a perception in the U.S. that the Europeans have lagged behind, that's a bit historical. And that was interesting to hear him say that for exactly the reasons that Jamil cited.
Yeah, and some countries are a little less enthusiastic, obviously, than others, but it's clear that you know, that Europe is for now pretty united on this topic. And it's interesting when you think about, I've been talking about this with senior people in the European Union institutions, and they made the point that despite some hiccups and a little bit of let's say war fatigue at the moment, the Ukraine, you know, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, full-blown invasion of Ukraine, has really brought Western Europe, but Europe in general, the European Union, together in a way that, you know, almost nothing has. And it's interesting, and I know we're going to talk about it a bit later, but this person made the very strong point that the conflict in Israel-Gaza has done the exact opposite, and we can get onto that a bit later. But it is absolutely torn Europe apart. There are, you know, just completely wildly different views and sympathies in different countries and within particularly on the left of politics in Europe and everywhere. It's such a divisive issue. Whereas, you know, Ukraine still, even with a bit of fatigue, even, you know, drawing into nearly 2 years, it's still a very unifying factor here. I
mean, Jamil, let's pick that up and Deb, let's shift to what is happening in Gaza and sort of its impact, not just in the area itself, which is extraordinary in terms of the humanitarian consequences of this war, and I know you've been focusing on that, but also talk a little bit about what Jamil already started talking about, which is this growing division between the United States, its singularly most important ally, and Israel over the course of the war. I mean, the newspapers are all full with the fact that Biden and sent Sullivan there to tell them you need to stop, change course, and of course Biden himself is saying all kinds of things, and the impact that is having on Israel and of course on the war itself.
So Austin's coming next week. So I think that we will see more of this rift, because it's not just about the war now. It's about, is there a plan for the day after? And what Washington wants and what Israel wants is very different. The Biden administration is pushing. It looks like Netanyahu's administration is stalling. They disagree on things like who will control Gaza, who will govern Gaza after the war. Netanyahu is very clear, not the Palestinian Authority, not Palestinians. This is what Washington wants. Washington wants to talk about a plan for a two-state solution. The UAE has said that they are not going to get involved in the reconstruction unless there's a plan for a two-state solution. And Netanyahu has said, we're not going to do this. So what we've had this week is terrible destruction among Gaza's civilians. Again, 86 journalists have died in Gaza so far. It's just extraordinary, 86. But there's also been deaths on the Israeli side. 86 members of the Golani Brigade were killed in northern Gaza. They got in a fight with Hamas. Hamas, who, if you listen to the Netanyahu administration, is almost vanquished. It is not. And you could see that this week 86 deaths in one of the most elite units in Israel is really something. At the same time, here, Israel has launched an information campaign. They have been organizing showings of this 40-minute horror film and what it is a compilation of GoPro videos that Hamas militants, they strap these cameras on when they cross the border, and those who died and left behind their cameras. This is what they're showing in elite universities, in Congress, in invited groups of journalists in both Washington and New York, and they're making the case that look at this. This is why we're so outraged. Both sides are involved in a deeply complicated information campaign. On the Gaza side, they are putting out their fight videos on Telegram to more than 500,000 followers, and their supporters are saying, "What happened on October 7th? We didn't do that. Hamas doesn't kill civilians. Hamas doesn't rape women. We don't do that." And so there's this fight online between the supporters of Israel and the supporters of Hamas over the truth of what happened. And we shall see, who wins the information war.
Hey, Deb, can I ask you just a quick question? I mean, this may be unknowable, but what I think gets at the root of the sort of U.S.-Israel dispute right now is, in some way, well, not the root, but one of the way they prosecuted the war. And the briefings we get frequently out of Jerusalem is Netanyahu is going to ignore international opinion. He's going to fight the war the way he wants to fight the war. He doesn't care what the international community says. And yet Netanyahu does actually have a history of being very sensitive to international, particularly American pressure, and has cut off previous operations because of American international pressure. I'm curious if you have any insight as to where you think Netanyahu's head is on this one, because we keep hearing briefings out of the U.S. in particular that come January, Israel is going to change this and they got to change. And whether you think Netanyahu actually will be changing the tactics and pull back to a more intelligence-based counterinsurgency kind of operation.
There's a new calculation in his head. He knows that when the war is over, there will be an inquiry. And he probably knows, if he can look at the numbers, that he will not politically survive it. And so he's got a couple of things that he might want to accomplish before that day comes. A, to keep the war going longer. I mean, if you want to survive politically, you kind of are duty bound for yourself to keep the war going longer so you don't have to face the inevitable inquiry. It remains to be seen how much pressure the U.S. will exert. They could cut off. There's so many things they could do. They've done none of them yet. So far, this is rhetorical pressure. We are not to the point of anything more than that. So, Netanyahu can look. Remember, in the Biden administration, he came all the way to Washington and spoke to Congress when he was against Washington. There was somebody yesterday in Haaretz that suggested, why doesn't Biden come to the Knesset and make the same kind of speech? That would be really something and unprecedented. But I think that Netanyahu's calculations have become more complicated for him personally.
Yeah, no, the internal politics in Israel is, of course, a problematical. But Jamil, I mean, how is the growing rift or the growing signs that Washington is very uncomfortable with what's happening on the day-to-day in Gaza, and I think, as Deb rightly said, a really big rift on what happens the day after the war that is just becoming bigger and bigger and bigger, and clearly that's where the Europeans are more with Washington than they are with Jerusalem. How does this change the internal dynamic and debate within Europe? And how are they watching Washington, and what would they like Washington to do? What's the pressure they're putting on Washington?
I mean, yeah, look, there is not much alignment, frankly, from most countries in Europe with Washington. Washington is still far more friendly towards Israel than most European countries, with probably the interesting, and for its own historical reasons, of course, Germany is the exception, I would say. But the tone of the discussion here is it's very divisive between specific countries. You have like Belgium and Malta and Spain and one or two others which are clamoring for ceasefire, unconditional ceasefire, and for Israel to be really pilloried and blamed for everything that's going on in the Middle East. And then you have countries like Germany and one or two others that are much more sympathetic, I would say, to Israel, in Germany's case for very specific historical reasons, obviously. Then you have sort of countries that are afraid to really take positions because maybe there's a sort of traditional sympathy towards Israel, but many of these countries have very large, recently arrived Muslim populations, relatively recently arrived. Some of them have several generations, but that is what's one of the things that's most interesting for us as journalists here, because nobody talks about it. But it is the main thing that is sort of the unspoken kind of thing just under the surface that is leading, in the case of the Netherlands, to a far-right pro-Israel, very anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant politician, Geert Wilders, to be elected. He just won the election, basically. It's unclear whether he'll be able to form a full government, but he got the most votes of anyone in the recent Dutch election. And the unspoken kind of elephant in the room here is that nobody wants to talk about it, but they're all very concerned about these large populations. And they're very, very, very concerned, and this you do hear a bit about, they're very worried about sympathy terrorist attacks in Europe, and particularly at Christmas time. So here you're getting warnings almost daily from different countries saying, heightened terror alert, without any context usually, and no politician wants to talk about it because it is such a fraught topic.
Can I say that, Arab leaders are worried about the same thing? They're worried about internal destabilization in populations who in some ways differ with their leadership. There's nobody that I can think of, except for maybe the Iranians and Hezbollah, who would cry one tear if Hamas disappeared. Not the Egyptians, not the Jordanians, certainly, not Saudi Arabia, not anybody in the Gulf. But their populations do. It's still a popular issue.
Can I throw one little bit more into this mix, even very quickly, which gets us back to domestic U.S. politics? Because I think we've talked about the Biden administration's position on this, and obviously a lot of this has to do with a disagreement with, as we all call it, the day after, and what a post-Gaza war Gaza looks like. Also with the way that the Israelis have prosecuted the war. But I think the one thing we haven't talked about yet is domestic political issues, because I find it very interesting the first time Biden actually said this publicly at a fundraiser this week, where he called on Netanyahu to change his tactics. It comes at a time the Democratic Party is beginning to split over this, and a lot of the young people in particular, who are the shock troops for a campaign in 2024, are beginning to leave the administration on this issue. There's obviously a lot of Muslim voters who would, in Michigan and other places, that would abandon the Biden administration on this as well. I do think there is increasingly a political calculus in the White House here that we're going into 2024 and we're losing our base. And unless and until this gets moved off the front pages in time and for the November elections, they could be really, not that people are going to turn up and vote for Trump, but they're going to lose that base that shows up and does the hard work on the ground in terms of campaigning and door knocking and that kind of stuff. And also they just might stay home and they might not vote in some of these big swing states. And I think there is a political calculus increasingly in Washington that they have to worry about and are thinking about as they become more and more aggressive with getting Israel to change its stance.
I think you're absolutely right, Peter. But let me add one more complication to this story, which I've been watching closely and wonder whether Deborah, you know the region so well, are paying attention to. There seems to be a growing divide between the United States and in this case the entire Israeli government on what to do in southern Lebanon. You are hearing more and more Israelis now going out publicly, and not just journalists and others, but Benny Gantz is now in a series of statements said that if the international community doesn't, quote, solve the problem of southern Lebanon, Israel will have to do it. The problem is that Hezbollah is violating the 2006 UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which said that there was a line beyond which they could not travel south. And of course, secondly, the fighting that continues to go on between Hezbollah and Israel has led to the departure of about 150,000 Israelis who can no longer safely live in the border communities, and they need to come back home. So, Deborah, how serious should we start thinking about, and given also your point about Netanyahu needing the war to continue, even if the Gaza operation sort of shifts to a new phase, it's never going to end because I think there will be a significant counterinsurgency, counterintelligence operations going after Hamas leaders. But how seriously you think about what can happen north, and a large part of the Israeli military is still up in the north, ready to quote respond to or quote fix the problem.
You are right to focus there because it's not getting the majority of coverage, and it's every day. There's something every day. For Hezbollah operatives are killed on the border by a missile strike. Hamas does the same, and plus, I think that the Israelis have kind of put this as a goal, as a war aim. We're not done until everybody can move back to the north and everybody can move back to the south. That's a big ask, considering where we are in this war. It seems unlikely that this happens like tomorrow or in 6 months to move these families back. You're right, Ivo, there is a UN resolution that says Hezbollah should not be where they are in the south, but they are. So how does that get solved? I don't know. And the problem between the two of them is mistakes get made. And somebody goes too far, and then there's a reaction, and we're back, in serious fighting at a time when the Israelis don't really want to wind down this war.
And Deb, just to follow that logic a little bit further, because what does that mean for Iran, right? Because you have both Hamas and Hezbollah, who are basically proxies of Iran, one more than the other. Then also we have the Houthis in Yemen, who clearly are also proxies of Iran, who are also bombing U.S. positions in Iraq and in Syria. At what point do the Israelis ramp up in the northern country towards the Lebanese border, and that triggers reaction in Tehran, where we then get a regional conflagration? I mean, I don't know if you can. Obviously, you don't have a direct line into the mullahs, but I'm just curious how concerned are you about that?
I'll tell you something. I was on another one of these yesterday with a bunch of security people who said, "Why isn't the Biden administration bombing the Houthis? Who said they couldn't? Teach them a lesson. Tell them that they can't do this." And you have to ask that question. So obviously, they're Iran's. They would rather keep their hands clean. It's not worth it for them to sacrifice Hezbollah for Hamas. They didn't like it in the beginning. I don't think they actually were consulted on when to start. It's not that it was a complete surprise to them, but it looked like the external Hamas leadership and the Iranians didn't quite know the extent to what was going to happen. So, the Houthis have been more effective than anybody, strangely. Who would have guessed that? But at some moment, I don't know, does the administration have to address it? They probably are thinking about it, I would expect.
Well, it all goes to show that lots of things to look forward to. In the final minutes that we have left, Jamil, let's talk a little bit about the unexpected new arrival at the summit. Donald Tusk, who of course was the council president for 5 years, but now coming back as the prime minister of a coalition government that defeated the outgoing PIS. Quite significantly. how, number one, how was he received when he got there, and importantly, how is this going to change sort of the internal dynamics of the EU, in which Poland was for 8 years a cog in the wheel, and now presumably becomes a more positive force, as well as dealing with issues like Ukraine and frankly European cooperation more generally.
Yeah, it's a really interesting, really highly significant election in 2023 when Donald Tusk came back as prime minister after 8 years of the Law and Justice Party in Poland. You now have a avowedly pro-European. I mean, he was the European Council himself, very pro-Europe, very pro, liberal with a small L, in the sense of wanting to restore the independent judiciary and things like that. It is really interesting, partly because it's counter-cyclical to the rest of the trends that are happening across the continent, which is a move to the right, a move to the more illiberal. I mentioned Geert Wilders earlier from in the Netherlands. Viktor Orban, we were talking about him earlier in Hungary. If you look in Germany, the far right is looking like it's going to potentially have a massive win in the East, in particular in the European elections coming up in a few months. So the sort of majority trend seems to be moving more illiberal. But in this case, it's gone in the other direction. And that's really interesting. Now, of course, dear Donald is back in Brussels. They're all very happy. The Eurocrats love him, and we're all very happy. And savior of Poland. What's really interesting is that it's going to be quite hard for him to reverse a lot of the things that PiS did in the Law and Justice Party did over the last 8 years, because they've stacked the media and they've stacked the judiciary, and they've got their favorite central bank governor in the office. There's a lot of things that they've done that are going to be using the tools of liberalism and democracy. It's going to be really hard to remove these people, using the due process. So Donald Tusk and his colleagues actually have a much higher hurdle than their opponents, if you like, because they have to follow the rules, whereas it's a bit easier for the ones who want to break the rules to bust things up, to change things. It's also true that Tusk is in a coalition with a variety of different parties. They're not all completely aligned on what needs to happen in Poland. Some of them are quite conservative, and for example, things around abortion in Poland, that is not going to be, there's not going to be unanimity on some of these issues. And if you listen to his speeches, he's giving a good kick at Germany, because Kaczynski in Poland calls him a German agent, and he's been quite tough even on Ukraine, and on immigration, for example. So it's not the kind of necessarily the sort of warm homecoming that as I say, the Brussels Eurocrat class was maybe hoping for. But there's a lot of celebrating here. Now the key will be whether they can unblock these grants and this regular EU development money. This more than 100 billion, well over 100 billion that's been kind of blocked by Brussels because of these rule of law questions and problems in Poland. And presumably that's his first task, is to try and unblock this money and get that money flowing. And that should potentially ease his path in some ways. But it's
a short question. And the short question is this. I was in Poland last summer, and it was very clear that the abortion issue was radioactive, that the Law and Justice Party had done removed a third exception. And that was, you couldn't get an abortion anymore if you had a child who was a fetus who wasn't viable. And the streets exploded. And there was an amazing amount of organization that you've seen in the United States in the same way. But Poland is a year ahead. And I wondered if that anger at the Law and Justice decisions to follow the church in how abortion laws and to erase almost all of the exceptions, how that played into this campaign. And it matters because it's going to happen here too.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting and important parallel. We have several people on the ground in Poland, and from their reporting, from what we're hearing, it certainly did play a big role. And there is obviously a conservative, mostly Catholic, large constituency that Law and Justice was playing to, but for younger women in particular, and many of the younger Poles who've lived in Western Europe, particularly in the UK, places like that, they have a very different view from the sort of the older, more conservative generation, and we believe that issue did play a big role. And I think you make the very important point that, and thank you for referring to the Politico scoop of the Roe v. Wade decision, even obliquely. Yeah, we do think that Roe v. Wade decision is going to be, in America, is going to be a big election issue, and not one probably that helps Republicans next year. I mean, you guys know better than me, but in our reporting, my colleagues in DC's reporting, that does seem to be where things are headed.
Jamil, can I ask you to go back to something you said earlier, which is Tusk as sort of a contrarian indicator to the rightward populist shift in recent European elections? You mentioned Wilders. You forgot to mention the Slovaks, Robert Fico. Very excited about the Slovak elections. But I just wonder if there's any sign or maybe this is grasping at straws, that this could be a sign of the swing back. I mean, you are going to have some time in the next 6 months, and I know it's not a EU country anymore, but Rishi Sunak is going to lose. You're going to get Keir Starmer in as Prime Minister of Britain, center left, after, particularly with Truss, a very right-wing populist government in the UK, not insignificant country in Europe, even if not in the EU. Even some of the prime ministers who have won, Meloni in Italy, particularly, who came in and we thought she was going to be right-wing populist, has clearly moved much more to the center on Ukraine, on other issues. Is there any chance you think that Tusk is a sign of the pendulum swinging back in the other direction at all?
Doesn't seem like it yet. In fact, we think, as I said, Germany is really a crucial one, right? With the AfD, the rise of Alternative for Deutschland. I mean, some people are saying, who knows, right? But some people are saying that in the European elections, the AfD could get, 50% of the vote or something in the German, seats of the European elections. And I mean, just if you look at France, and Marine Le Pen has come close, twice. But today people are predicting that next time she's gonna make it. Not everyone's predicting, but there are credible voices who are saying that's where things are headed in France, and it does feel at the moment like the pendulum is still swinging, even if you have a couple of these counter examples. And I think you're right to point to the UK, although the UK, British exceptionalism is alive and well, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of others. Of course, Finland went the other way in 23 as well. Sweden went the other way in 23. You can argue that Spain stayed, but that's pretty unique in some ways. And Sanchez lost the election, but he's still there. Is one way to, it just wasn't as bad as people had expected, and he was able to figure out a way to maintain there. So it is a mixed bag, but Wilders was a big thing. I mean, that was 23% of the Dutch vote. That's virtually unheard of. It's been a long time since somebody had that, even when the Liberals under Rutte were doing as well as they did before. So it's a mixed bag, and of course we have a small election here in the United States, which will be part of one trend or the other. We will have to watch and see that closely. I mean, one of the questions I think, just to finish off, is sort of how much does foreign policy and the kinds of issues that we've talked about, Ukraine, Gaza, actually Europe, affect the decision makings of voters in Europe and in the United States? And we only have a minute, so Deb, let's start with you. Your thought on should we think about? Should people watch this show in order to figure out what's going to happen in elections?
I don't know. I consume more social media than I care to admit, and I have just seen these these manifestos. I will never vote for Trump because of what he's done with Gaza and how his embrace of these Arab Americans are saying, I'm done. I'm not doing this. And, I find myself saying, I've been an American longer than you. Here's the thing. You choose the least worst choice. That's what you get in American elections. So keep that in mind when you decide what you're going to do. But yeah, I've seen it. I've seen a lot of it.
I would say the other thing is, I think one of the most pressing and dynamic issues in all these elections we're talking about is the issue of immigration, right? It is affecting the U.S. election. It's affecting almost every European election. And that is impacted by wars, climate change, all these things we talk about in this show. So I would say that it may have a bit of a bank shot, but I think the fact that we are living in a world that is in chaos right now is having a direct effect on domestic politics in all these countries. So I think if our voters are going to go to the polls and say I am voting for Donald Trump or Joe Biden or Keir Starmer or Rishi Sunak because of their foreign policy, not necessarily, but their foreign policies will matter because stability in these regions is affecting the inward migration issues, and I think that is become in the U.S. in particular, but also in Europe, one of the most important dynamics of all these elections, I would argue.
Yeah, no, I think Jamil, you got the final word. What do you think?
I completely agree with Peter Spiegel that immigration unheard of. No, it is the topic of migration that is driving the political discussion everywhere in the Western world today, and it's just whether people are talking about it openly or not. It is the main sort of string that connects all of these big elections that we're going to have: UK, Europe, US, and many other places in 2024.
Well, if there's one thing clear, just to reemphasize that point, is that we are likely to see more people moving in 2024 than we did in 2023. One of the things that we sort of hinted at but didn't really push forward, if Ukraine doesn't get settled on the economic and the military side, there are a lot of people who came to Europe, went back to Ukraine, and who, if there is no electricity or there's fighting in near Odessa and Kyiv, would be taking the first train back out west, and that will be an issue too. We'll be watching it all. I want to thank Deborah Amos, formerly of NPR, now at the Princeton University, Peter Spiegel of the Financial Times, and Jamil Anderlini of Political Europe for an excellent discussion, and thank all of you for tuning in. We'll be back next week with another and our last 2023 version of the World Review. And until then, everyone, have a wonderful weekend.